All right, I'm glad to have Rick Kurtz with us today from Metro State University. Go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Patsy, and really appreciate that, all the technical support. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you to all of you who are able to join us for this session. I know we've got a number of sessions here today, and I feel it's like when I go to a conference, you go and you find yourself, it's like, oh, I want to go to this session, I want to go to this session, and they're all at the same time. So it's always a little bit challenging trying to pick that one that you want to go to. And fortunately, with them being recorded, there's that opportunity to come back and look at this again. So what I want to do this morning is I'm going to be building upon the remarks I had during the opening keynote. And it's, for those of us in a leadership position, it's oftentimes we have to bring a bit of a different perspective because we think about it from the standpoint of resources and also from the standpoint of how do we pull this together to partner to help make these kind of things happen. And just as a side note, again, if you didn't catch my point during the last session, I'm currently at Metro State University, but previously when I was really involved heavily into developmental education, it was during my time at South Central College, where I was there 3.5 years, Dean of Arts and Sciences, and had developmental education under my, under my umbrella. And so that's really where I got my deep dive into everything Dev Ed. Okay, so that said, what's the challenge? I mean, we certainly in the opening remarks you saw, there were good things accomplished, good things going on. But I think maybe it's an opportunity now to take a step back, because certainly when I became immersed in developmental education, it was really that getting your arms around, okay, well, what's the problem? I come from that's why I have my current role, my current dean as a dean of public affairs. I come from a background of public administration. And we always begin with this thing we call defining the problem. How do you define the problem? And so that really is getting our hands around it and really getting some clarity on that. Now, certainly Minnesota State System, to their credit, hosted a number of workshops. The affinity group that helped bring on today's event, certainly an Atlas certainly helped in that regard, providing resources and helping us think about it. But then really, how do we think about it at our level and what's important here and what's going on? So really, I'm a simple person, so I try to simplify things. And here's the reality, sort of the bottom line. All college students face obstacles. And in fact, looking over the numbers, really, I'll talk about a range. For the college students today, just across the board, if you look at undergraduate college students, what you typically see is the success rate getting them to graduation within 6 years. It's anywhere from about 64 to maybe, the low to mid 70s. And this is across public and privates lumped together as a whole nationally. And so it's, the overall rate by no means is where we want it to be. But for students who come in with a specific set of challenges, what we might call markers or indicators or flags, use your term. For these students in particular, we used to use the term at-risk students, which has not the best connotation to it. Because I would say there's students who just have a chance, who haven't given the chance, the opportunity to identify the problems. So for this group of students really who have these markers, these flags, what are we talking about? Typically as follows, that set up barriers for them in their success. First generation students. Why is that a barrier? Well, in part because when we look at first generation students, what we see is that, of course, they don't have an anchor. I'm a first generation student myself. And I have to say, when I first started college, I didn't know a dean from a president, from a professor, from a hole in the wall. These titles, they all meant nothing to me. And so first generation students, they don't have that older, they don't have that parent, and that's the typical definition, a parent who's completed college. And in many cases, they don't have an older sibling. So they don't have that anchor, somebody to turn to say, hey, help me make sense of this. Tell me what's going on here. And so that's one of their problems that they face. Another situation is often what we see is these students, a factor that we have to look at is income. Low income families, a student who comes from a low income environment, be it working class, be it somebody who's in poverty, going to college and the things you give up, this thing we call the opportunity cost, right? It doesn't come easily. And so both the actual cost and the opportunity cost of what you give up are barriers to completion and to entry into higher education. Another thing we see is many of these students, so many of them, are members of disadvantaged groups. That could be, and by no means exhaustive here, just a couple of examples, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, LGBTQ, veterans, and the list goes on. It's more expansive than this, of course. But people coming from those groups typically also have greater challenges and face more obstacles when it comes to persisting and succeeding in a college setting. And finally, out of my short list, working adults. You know, we used to think of working adults basically as somebody who's over what we'd call the traditional student age, older, 24 years or older. But what we found, particularly in COVID, it was aggravated that much more, that a working adult really, this person could be 19, could be 20 years old. Basically, they say these days, the definition is anybody who's 2 or more years out of high school and who's working 2/3 of the time or more. Now, if you're a working adult, helping to feed a family, maybe you're needed to contribute to your immediate nuclear family as a young adult, that they count on you earning an income, that's time that certainly you're taking away from your education. And so what we find, there's that balance between your time on the job and then your time in your studies, your time in class, and those things clash. And that certainly is not an easy obstacle to overcome. And sometimes it can really pull you apart trying to balance those two things. All right, so what we see with these students, we see these flags come up who have multiple numbers of these flags in their lives. Really what often happens with these students is they become caught in what I refer to as the developmental education course quagmire. That is, they get in there and they just don't seem to be able to get out. And so when we look at the students who have these various flags nationally, the numbers, traditionally speaking, are abysmal. 89% of this demographic, and this just blew me away when I when I was doing early research on this, and the numbers still hold true, fail to graduate in 6 years with any kind of degree or award, culminating award whatsoever. 89%, that is just, in 6 years, that's just unbelievable. But that's the reality. Nationally, we see that between 20 and 22% of students with these indicators, with these markers, ultimately persist, and complete their 2-year program. Again, that's not the kind of number where we want to be, but it's the reality of where we are. So how in the world are we going to turn this trajectory around? You know, and for me as an administrator, certainly for the Min State system, certainly as it was mandated, that came down from our state legislature and the governor signed, saying, you know, they too said this is unacceptable. In fact, nationally, word was going out in multiple states. This is unacceptable. We have to come up with new strategies to turn this around. And at the time, first taking the dive in this and meeting with colleagues and going to different meetings and working groups, it was like almost overwhelming, just the number of possible solutions of the things that might work, could work, did work, should have worked. And as I mentioned earlier, there's only so many resources to go around. And that's and if you're going to make this happen, resourcing is so important. I mean, that's the reality. And so you've got to really think about this, think this through, use your resources wisely. And how do you pull out of these many options and pull those that really are going to work for you, your organization, your institution? Because they may not be identical across, there's no one way that's the perfect right way, right? If we're driving from Minneapolis, St. Paul to LA, there's multiple routes. And it's the same thing here. But we know where we want to go. We want to up and increase the persistence and the completion rate of these students. So for me, again, being a rather, I'll call it simplistic person in the way I think, it's how do we develop a manageable model? And the model from my standpoint, thinking about it, is based on what I like to think of as a three-legged stool approach. How to organize it in my mind and think about how we get a grasp on this. And so that's what I want to turn to now and spend a little bit of time talking about how we created our stool and what its purpose is. Now, at the end of the day, basically what you want to do is create a stool that backstops our students. That is, provides them with the foundation to help them move forward, to persist, and to do it in a timely manner, to basically to minimize and turn it around those abysmal rates we had in persistence and completion. That's really the goal. So how do we backstop it? What are the things we're going to have to put in here to help make that happen? So leg number one of our stool, student college readiness placement, right? Is the student college ready? I mean, when you talk about our two-year institutions, they are open access. But with that said, nobody wants to bring a student in and set them up for failure. So there are some minimum expectations about whether they're college ready, and how do you gauge that? How do you gauge their entry-level placement? Are they ready for those, what we call those gateway courses? The old way we always did it was the standardized exam. That thing called, at the two-year colleges, typically, at least here in Minnesota, it was the AccuPlacer. But it could be the ACT, it could be the SAT, pick your poison. One of the things we've learned quickly was this need to move beyond the standardized exam. And why is that? Well, first and foremost, what we find is, I love this great term. I'm one of these people who likes to work a little bit with probability and statistics. And there's a term we use, it's called construct validity. And that's basically saying what you're doing, does it really predict? Is it valid in its prediction model about what should take place or what's going to take place? What we find, the analysis going back years upon years shows that standardized exams lack construct validity. That is, they are a poor predictor of student readiness. And I'll give a big shout out to folks in the systems in Georgia, Texas, and California who really did some deep dives on this and shared their information, as well as some of the large nonprofit organizations tied, for example, to Lumina, and saying that it's just doesn't cut it from the standpoint. In fact, what we find basically with standardized exams, on average, they place students 1 to 2 levels below where they should be from the standpoint of college readiness. Now, that is a sad fact, and that just is not where we want to be. Okay, well, if we're not going to rely on the standardized exams, and maybe if there's a small silver lining to COVID and its introduction, was that when the onset of COVID hit, standardized exams basically were shut down. So even though we were moving, what should we say, we were sludging in that direction, COVID caused us to really step up our game and go into it a big way, because we simply couldn't gather students together to do standardized exams. And so the better alternative is known by the term multiple measures. Now, you might hear different ways, but most commonly used is this term multiple measures. And it's a better alternative to the default placement in developmental education through standardized exams. Now, what the points I'm going to raise here, my key points, aren't again by any means exhaustive, but there are those that we had worked with and employed at my institution, and I know some of the other institutions across the Minn-State system utilized variations of this. So first and most important, all the evidence of all the studies have shown that the number one best indicator, if you only had to use one, is going to be overall high school GPA. How did that student do in their 4 years of high school? What was their GPA there overall? And then breaking it down, what was their GPA in those foundational areas? That is in reading and English. What was their GPA in math? What, did the student self-identify as an English as a second learner student? And were they taking ESL courses in high school? And what was their success there? Now, of course, I'm going to throw a caveat in here because COVID also brought for us a great disruption for many of our high school students. Going to the virtual environment for many of those students was not an easy transition. And so we're going to have to deal with that and are dealing with that now. Many two-year colleges certainly are, from the standpoint of working around and through that disruption that came through COVID and its impact on students during those formative high school years. I have a daughter just graduated last year, and she certainly was in that boat among that group. For a year and a half, she basically took her classes in a virtual environment. So if high school GPA isn't the only thing we can count on, what else can we use? One that's become, has showed some solid success is student-guided self-placement and utilization of this tool to determine personal readiness. Now, what am I talking about here? That sounds like a mouthful. And basically it's a simple rubric in each of the key areas, math, English and reading, and students who self-identify as English as their second language. The rubric takes them through, and it's almost like an if-then. So for example, easy example here with reading in English. If you believe you can write in comprehensive sentences and do not struggle with that, then go on to the next level. If you believe you're able to write in coherent paragraphs and A, B, C, and D, then go on to the next level. But it's a way for students basically to work through that rubric in those areas and see where they place. In the case of math, it's going through the different levels of math equations and asking them to think about and work through their ability to successfully complete those. Then based on that, the suggestion will come out, well, here's your level of readiness and where you are. The interesting thing about this is the concern was that many students would basically self-place higher than they really were. But what we found, and also data nationally, students actually were in many cases, oftentimes in disbelief, and they self-placed lower than they needed to really be. They didn't really believe in their readiness, that they were that ready. And I think part of that may be a confidence situation for these students. And so the third thing then, that for those students, I'm going to have to backtrack here a second. For high school GPA, when you get to a student also who's 5 years or more, some cases 10 years or more out of high school, that guided self-placement also comes in very important for those students. Then finally, we've got the group who successfully completed through our, say, for example, our ABE partners, completed a GED curriculum and got their high school diploma. That GED basically does also provide an indication overall of self-placement and readiness for that student with regards to moving into college level courses. And I might add the final thing, one of the things we did in all cases, students, of course, meet with an advisor to go through these things and make sure everybody's on the same page. All right, the second leg of our stool, accelerated developmental education courses. Okay, one of the prior slides, I talked about that problem with that persistence rate. A big part of it also has to do, all right, I saved this, held this in the back room, is the time it takes traditionally for students to go through their developmental education courses. You know, typically a student who came in who was at the lowest level of college readiness in developmental education, it would, let's say, an English and reading or a math sequence, it'd take them upwards of 4 semesters. You know, that's the better part of almost 2 years, you might say, to get through and to complete those classes just to get into their gateway, their college level courses. And so if we start thinking about students and their dropout, you know, you got to point a finger right at that one. In fact, that's what all the analysis and the evidence has shown. So what's the solution? The things that we partnered with, and again, across the system and with our other partners, was developing fast track block courses to basically take those 4 semesters, for example, in reading and English and put them in to basically a block session, say of 8 credits that they would complete over the course of a single semester. So every day, this intensive, say from 8 a.m. to noon, Monday through Thursday, they were in these block classes, getting this deep dive immersion. You know, it's similar, I come from a military background, and it's similar to what we did in the military with so many of our A schools, that deep dive immersion to develop people's expertise in a specialized area. And so this is what we did and implemented reading in English. By the time I had left South Central, we were also well on our way for the math classes. ESL was a bit off in years to come yet, but in the pipeline. But what you certainly find, all the evidence shows that this is a great way to minimize the disenchantment and the dropout that comes with an extended developmental education curriculum. The students see strides, they see progress, they see it in short order. Okay, leg 3 of our stool, we're building our stool, we're getting there. So the third leg of our stool is extensive and ongoing student academic support. That is the third leg of our stool. And of course, maybe the hidden message in here on this one is resourcing. Resourcing in people and resourcing in the money to help make it happen. These things, again, they don't happen on a dime or on a shoestring, or saying, go make this happen in addition to all the other things you are doing. You know, I mentioned the opening session, we got some initial block grant money from the Minnesota state system, which certainly helped. And when I was at South Central College, there were also some grants we succeeded in getting, which helped, but you need to have that resourcing, the financial side. The other side you need to have, this is where it's particularly important with your ABE partners. And again, we experimented with a number of models here. And the one we finally hit on was the ABE, the co-instructors embedded in our classrooms. So within those block classes is basically having our ABE instructors right there along with our college instructors. And so working as a team, basically the college instructor taking the lead and the ABE instructor being that co-lead. And so this was so important because no one college instructor can do it all. And so having that second person, that ABE person there in the classroom made all the difference. We ran courses both ways, without the ABE co-instructor and with the ABE co-instructor. You could clearly see the difference in your success. Now I'll say here, Co-instructors in the classroom weren't uniformly applied across all the areas. In fact, what we found, we got the most bang for the buck for co-instructors in the classroom in math and also in ESL and the ESL courses. For reading, those classes, the high touch they needed every day was really where we got the most benefit from those co-instructors. For reading in English, those students certainly needed support, but it wasn't on as intensive every day like it was in the other classes. So for those students in the reading and English courses, we did something a little bit different. We did use some of our ABE colleagues, took advantage of their talent, and also our in-house, our student tutoring center to have intensive student tutoring sessions once or twice a week, depending on where we were in the flow for these students. And those services, of course, are open to all students, but for the reading in English particularly. The other big thing to help make this a success, if you're going to have it happen, is things tied to tutoring and what your co-instructors are doing, mandatory study lab sessions. Much like you have a biology course and then you have a lab session tied to it, it's part of it, it's part of the credits, it's part of what you're graded on. Those mandatory study lab sessions are so important. We at first did them as, I'll call it voluntary. Students were encouraged to show up. The rate of student participation was abysmal, and it showed up in our success rate. Again, this gets back to some of these students, for example, being working adults. And so that trade-off saying, well, gosh, should I go home and get sleep? Or should I work overtime at my job? Or should I go to the study lab session? The study lab sessions usually got the short end of the stick. So you have to build that in as part of the curriculum and just make it mandatory, make it part of it. That's the reality of where you are if you're going to be successful. I think without it, it's really a hard slog to overcome that problem. All right, now I've unloaded a lot on you all here already today about the things we did. And remember, this is the world according to Kurtz. So this isn't a tell-all be-all. This is simply one person's perspective on what I learned on this journey. But you know, the future, here's the things going forward that basically I learned and certainly encourage my colleagues to think about. Number one is being flexible. To shift is to change with the shifting needs. We simply all have to recognize that the old way of doing things, it was, what was it, to paraphrase Einstein, doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different outcome, you know, is lunacy. So we're going to have to be willing to be flexible and to change. And that is important because we have these other things coming down the road. I mentioned in the opener, co-requisite courses. And a co-requisite course, if you're not familiar with it, basically you have your college gateway course, let's say a Math 100 course. And then these students who aren't fully college ready, they are enrolled in that, but they're partnering with a companion Dev Ed course where, again, that Dev Ed instructor, and usually it's an ABE partner, it could be an ABE partner, are basically is teaching that Dev Ed course, and those two instructors are working together as a team. So what I learn on Monday in my Dev Ed course, I'm going to apply on Tuesday in my Math 100 course and build upon that. And it's that constant back and forth, that reinforcement. And so we certainly know co-requisites have been used. Again, they're another way to help get those students to the finish line quicker, but it requires a whole lot of coordination and appropriate resourcing if you're going to make that happen. Again, that's a reality. The continuation of the college ABE partnerships. Those are so valuable. And also just the things you learn from your ABE partners along the way. They've been in many of these things for years longer, certainly than I had. My partners, the directors at Mankato and Faribault, you know, just a font of knowledge and expertise that I could tap into, as well as their teachers and their professional staff. though you have to continue with those partnerships, in my mind, if you're going to continue to make these things successful and get these students to the finish line. And then, of course, the innovations that go along with that. Finally, there's this recognition of the changing in our demographics. In many states, certainly here in Minnesota, we see that our demographic of the traditional age college student, that's a demographic that's getting smaller. And so we have fewer of these students rolling over and coming to college. And so certainly we're going to have to serve those students. And also we certainly know that Minnesota has increased workforce needs. And what this is going to require, along with what we have, the innovations in technology, is reskilling and retooling for current working adults. They're going to have to come back. In fact, the most recent numbers I read for a millennial and a Gen Z, on average, they're going to probably have to come back 3 to 5 times, depending on their career track, to reskill and retool. And they're going to be looking to us in many regards to help make that happen. I know at my current institution, here at Metro State, we have partnerships with a number of employers to do that very kind of thing. And so we all have to be prepared for it. And these students, again, their level of readiness to re-engage back in college and up their skills, they may be rusty in many cases. So we're going to have to help them out there. I mean, I know myself just working with my daughters and going back and doing algebraic equations with them. Gosh, I had to go online to Khan Academy to brush myself up on them first before I sat down with my daughters. So I couldn't remember some of these things. And so they're going to be a little rusty in some cases, or in some cases, it's simply a skill set that they didn't develop at that time when they were in their formative high school or post-high school years. So we're going to have to be there to work with them and to help them along the way. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here. See if I can do this properly.
Yeah, and you did have a number of questions that I'm happy to draw your attention to.
Yes, please.
Able to keep up.
I'd appreciate that, Patsy, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So there have been several just in the last couple of minutes, but I'm gonna go back a little ways. You had one question towards the beginning, wondering when those working groups started. They're trying to get a sense of when this work took place. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it initially started. Oh, now you're challenging my mind here, my short-term memory. If I recall correctly, okay, and I wouldn't swear on this on a Bible in a court of law, but if I recall correctly, the Min state system started making the monies available to help launch it because the legislation was passed. I think it was 2017. It was finally began to be invoked, and then 2018-19, the money started to flow in, but it was really like, I'll say fall 19 that the traction really started to take off. There were preliminary meetings prior to that, and this was across Min state system. And I'm not sure, Leslie might know, I see Leslie's on this call from the standpoint of when the affinity group got started. Leslie, can you add on that?
Sure. This is the 3rd year. So actually we started, I think, about 6 months after COVID hit. Okay.
So what perfect timing. So that's when we first started. But I would say, by 2019, the traction was really going. I mean, we had some basic game plans in place, but implementation really hadn't kicked off. And so that's at least, and I'm speaking in part from my knowledge. I know there were some others who may have been a little earlier. That's from my knowledge and what I recall.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question came up. Are there multiple measures currently being considered for prospective college students who attended school outside of the US? Often those high school transcripts, of course, either they don't have them or they don't use a GPA sort of system. So they may be college ready or not. What can you say about non-US transcripts coming in?
That's always a challenge that is a challenge trying to basically And our professional advisors and people in admissions do a much better job with that than I do. But it's, in part, it is trying to get that information and saying what conveys, for example, are they on a 5-point scale? Well, how does that get adjusted and conveyed and put into a GPA here in, say, in the state of Minnesota in our scale? So I would say it's something that, from my experience, admissions and advisors have been grappling with. If there's an admission person here along the lines, or somebody who has might expand on that further than me, because I was basically kind of a step removed from that. So it would come up in meetings, but I don't know how far advanced they are along that pathway.
Yeah,
And then
I guess
see
I
my
would just, sorry, if someone wants to speak up, they're welcome to raise their hand or unmute. Yeah.
I see my colleague Kim Johnson on this call. Kim might be able to shed some light on that if she's able to respond.
Yeah, Kim, if you are, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I will put another question to you in the meantime.
Okay.
There is an offering of another research study if you want one. There's an idea around someone who argues that PSEO college courses are an excellent indicator for college readiness. And is there perhaps an opportunity for a study to see what happens with PSEO participants once they reach college?
You know, I haven't seen any studies that look specifically at PSEO students and converting that, you know, and then transitioning that GPA to college readiness. But certainly from the standpoint, it is considered when they come in as part of that mix, how well they did. And I'll speak from personal experience and from the institutions I was at, where we had students come in with those PSEO credits. Just anecdotally, it did seem to be a really good indicator of where they were, because usually you have the most, what should we say, the students who are the most gung-ho oftentimes are taking those classes, and they are highly motivated. But if anybody else wants to add, please come on, identify and come on in and add your expertise on this.
Yeah, there were a couple comments from Randy Bergman. Randy, I don't know if you want to come in and say a few words or clarify what your thinking is.
Well, greetings, everyone. My video, for whatever reason, of course, doesn't work right now. But yeah, I didn't expect to jump in the conversation, but I did want to, I mean, is that with PSEO students, now I'm in the Anoka area with Anoka Hennepin, Anoka Technical College. Very familiar with Forest Lakes partnerships with Pine Tech, Century College, and then even Inver Hills College. And many students, not just your high, you know, are enrolled in PSEO programs, even in the career tech areas. But the goal of getting their associate's degree and their high school is not the primary goal of PSEO. The goal is to explore college courses and then for a trade, that's a fantastic goal, is to get a trade. But then that next step of completing the Associate of Arts degree is what I bring to the attention. But what I was getting at is with developmental ed, there is, even though you've completed what in high school, that career tech field, I find a barrier is that, well, some of these other requirements to that degree, the student tends to need more support, if you know. So, but again, there just hasn't been enough studying, and I mean, I know Mary Berry had a document a couple of years ago about PSEO students, but really looking more at that, at the value of having a college experience before you're in college, and how college coursework is motivating for students. And that's what I was kind of bringing up to everyone's attention.
That was really helpful, Randall, and insightful. I really appreciate that, because you certainly are closer to it and have a better grasp on it than I do. So thank you. Patsy, do we have some more questions here to address?
Yeah, we have an excellent one from Julie Dinkow, our colleague at the Department of Education. Now, many deans do not know ABE exists. How did you come in your work at South Central, for example? How did you come to know that this was something you needed to not only know about, but really dig into and partner with? Can you say a little more?
You know, I had, prior to my taking on the position, South Central did have some relationship with ABE, but I think what really helped was the directors, first at Mankato and then at Faribault, they reached out to me. And particularly, I'll say Karen Walters at Mankato, just a dynamic partner. And she and I had many opportunities to work together over that period to just learn from each other. And I would say from the standpoint of anybody here who is with ABE in that kind of position, and you haven't had an opportunity to reach out with your with colleges in your area, please do so, because they just are dynamic partners. And fortunately, they reached out to me, and I just in part ran on their coattails, which was wonderful.
Well, we are indebted to Karen for all that work. We know they have great partnerships in Mankato, so thank you. Yeah, another question has come about around college navigation. So as a college navigator, this person writes, I've recently seen courses with extra support. So like extra in-class tutoring, more class time being offered in schools such as St. Paul College, such as Biology 101 with some extra support and recitations and such. Is this a result of college ABE partnership or something that's unique to these schools? What's your take?
I would say possibly both, just from what my discussions over the period of being involved. Some institutions, for example, particularly in the sciences, learned by the girth of sweat of their brow that this was really necessary to help these students succeed in these courses. And so I know at South Central, for example, in the biological studies, anatomy, physiology, they had something along these lines in place already. But in other cases, certainly speaking from my own experience, I think what we learned from partnering with ABE helped make us think about that more broadly in some other course areas.
Thank you. Well, they keep coming, so we have 6 more minutes. I'll just keep throwing them at you here.
Yeah, okay.
Will developmental education students still be paying for their developmental ed credits alongside the credits for college-ready co-requisite courses?
I'd love to say no, but as far as everything I have seen, unless somebody's or something running through, say, for example, for the state legislature, at least here in Minnesota, it's basically there are grants out there, and there's certainly Pell monies, which is probably the biggest thing that the majority of students use. But, and I had heard some talk, I think at Michigan, if I'm not their governor most recently called for basically 2-year college degrees, and I don't know what the parameters on that are at zero cost. And that was just introduced, I think, in her State of the State address here last month. So I don't know the details and how it looks in the legislation. I see a hand up, so maybe somebody can enlighten us further if they have some additional information.
Yeah, Yan Mei has been very active in the chat, and I've been collecting all the great things that you've been posting in another document for people. Thank you for being so active. Do you want to say more about this question?
No, I'm sorry. I just raised my question because I have another very important one to ask. I was thinking I might run out of time, so I'm sorry for giving you the wrong message.
You have the floor, no worries.
Okay.
That's okay.
Yeah, my burning question is actually about the co-requisite, the adoption, the statewide adoption of the co-requisite model by 2026, and how was this proposed, and how do you think about this in the context, given what you had just talked about, the inequities and also the learning loss during the pandemic? I have been teaching at Century for a decade, and the co-requisite for 9 years. And what you talked about, those things, the students, I work with them on a daily basis with tutoring. Century has wonderful resources, and I have tutors. However, for some students, their academic skills are so low that it was impossible. Like I don't have the magic wand. I work with them very closely, and also they don't have the time. This adult education possibility gives me a lot of hope. However, at this point, the Min State is pushing this co-requisite model across the state. I just want to hear some of your thoughts and, perspectives on this.
Sure. I can offer my limited thoughts and perspectives such as it is. The co-requisite actually, when the discussion was first going on before the legislature and the governor signed the whole thing about accelerated dev ed, was really, there was a group that was really pushing to just jump right to co-requisite. And so, and saying that's, and I know most recently, for example, again, Michigan, they mandated co-requisite in its phase. And also, I don't know if they're farther along than we are here in Minnesota or not. And some other states have worked with co-rec. But, Minnesota State, if I recall my history on this, the system said, well, let us see what we can do to get up to speed and look at alternatives on this. And the thing that emerged from all that is much like, they say legislation is much like making sausage. You don't want to know how it's done. They came up with the idea of basically the block classes, and then that led to all these other things I talked about. But co-requisite, I think, to really help make that happen, and I see Leslie's got a item in the chat here that may be relevant. I think co-requisite, if you're really going to be successful, and number one, part of it gets back to that resourcing thing, and I hate to beat the drum on that, but that is reality. You can't do it on a dime. And also, as I understand the way it's going to be implemented is reading in English and math first, and knowing that ESL has greater challenges, that one will be set farther back on the burner and brought in once they've grappled and gotten these other areas implemented. But it is going to take phasing in. And I think much like of what we've done here along the way, these going back to 2018, 19, it's like a dance, sort of 2 steps forward, 1 foot back, shift to the left, shift to the right. And so it's not going to be a perfect straight line.
Are there any possibilities for faculty working in the trenches to contribute to the planning and the policy making? Because in the past, I have been very passively accepting what is thrown to me. But recently, I think the more we talk about equity, the more policies that are coming out, which are exactly hurting students who have already been historically marginalized and disadvantaged. So that is very discouraging for somebody who works with students very closely. So
I'll say 2 quick things to that, because I see we're at our time sequence here. We want to acknowledge that. Number one, I'd suggest if you don't participate already, join the affinity group that Leslie Blicker and Russ head up or help facilitate, because that's one place you can really get in touch with people like-minded and get into that larger network. And number 2, from the standpoint of influencing, certainly it's that opportunity at anything that's going on in your institution when those meetings are held or those general discussions to influence that and have that voice put out there. And I think next Tuesday is like colleges at the Capitol Day. I'd have to look that date up, but I think it's next week, next Tuesday. That'd be a chance to get your voice heard too, and certainly visit your legislators. So I'll stop on that note because I know we're up against time.
We are. Thank you so much. And I so appreciate your time today, Dean Kurtzen, for your expertise and for all those who contributed in the chat. I have collected some of the very useful links that people dropped in the chat and put them in a doc that's in your chat a couple chats ago that you can find. There's a larger conference participant folder where you can get all the slideshows to all the sessions, things you missed, things you went to, as well as any relevant documents or resources or handouts that folks shared. So I've dropped that link as well as the direct link to those to those links that were shared today. And then the next thing you all need to know is how to get to your next session. So let me be sure you use this flyer to get to your next session, which begins in 4 minutes, friends. So thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see you
everyone.
Everyone.
Appreciate it. Have a good one.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye now.
All right, I'm hanging out for just a moment, but then I'm going to need to close this and open up the next one. Stephen, I just dropped the link that you need. Oh, you got it. Good. All right. Thank you, Julie, Randy, Annie, Angie, Alicia. We'll see you in the next session. Thank you so much.